Good afternoon, and welcome to the first lecture in our new series called As the World Burns. And today we are going to be considering the history, the more modern history of Egypt as a way of sort of bringing some context to understanding of events going on in Egypt today. My name is Alex Angel, and I will be your host. And I'd like to start out by describing an assumption. It's controversial, but as a student of history, if not a teacher of history, I would like to believe that if you have a knowledge of historical events, and you combine that with an awareness of current events, what's going on in the world today, that may give you a tool or an ability to actually see the sort of the momentum of the likely outcome, at least, of where events are heading. It's not exactly gazing into a crystal ball, but it's helpful. And it's a message that I've been conveying to students over time, and I thought what we might do is apply that assumption to a real-life situation today. So here is the task. I am going to give you a brief outline of the history of modern Egypt. Dr. Sabri will be forwarding you a variety of short articles on sort of an analysis of current events in Egypt. And what you are going to do is, based on your history of Egypt and the articles that you've read about what's going on there, when we meet on March 29th, you're going to show up with a written forecast, a projection, if you will, of where things might be going in Egypt, anticipating the outcome, or seeing where this is all heading. And that written scenario, I hope, is going to be broad enough so that you can, claim some accuracy. See, I was right. And yet specific enough so that it might be useful, certainly as a platform for some interesting discussion, which I look forward to. So that's the assumption, that's the task. And already I find us at something of a crossroads, what I would describe as the storyteller's dilemma. Where am I supposed to begin the story of modern Egypt? I find it increasingly difficult to talk about anything these days without going all the way back to the Crusades. And in this case, I'm going to have to say we're going to have to go back even further than that. So bear with me. We're going back to the last ice age. And let me introduce at this point a sort of a theme, if you will, not necessarily a tool, but a useful framework for understanding some events. That theme is the impact of climate and geography on different cultures. And we're going to use that framework, the impact of climate and geography, to get a look at the origins of the ancient culture of Egypt. And I will go through this with all deliberate speed, but here we are. If you were to parachute back in time 17 or 20,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, and you were to sort of stroll across the Sahara Desert, you would find, in fact, that it was not a desert at all. It was a swamp. Because one of the results of the last ice age, as the ice cap melted, it left behind a reservoir, a residue of water, which had yet to be absorbed into the water tables in the ground of North Africa. And so probably 15 to 18,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert today was a swampland. Fast forward through time, and as the climate begins to change and heat up, that swamp becomes a grassland, a svelte, and it turns into a grassland conveniently, roughly to coincide with the agricultural revolution. So in the Sahara Desert of, say, 10 or 12,000 years ago, it is a perfect environment to sustain not just the more migratory hunter-gatherers, but they will then settle down and farm the savanna lands of what is today the Sahara. And they will do that for a couple of thousand years until, as the climate begins to change and the grasslands dry out and the moisture in the soil can no longer hold down the plants, or the plant roots no longer hold down the soil, you begin this process of desertification. And how that actually influences the history of modern Egypt is not difficult to anticipate. The peoples that had settled in the Sahara are going to move away. And that begins what is known as the Bantu migrations. Because some of those peoples will move south and bring their agricultural technologies into what is today sub-Saharan Africa with their language, which is the root of the Bantu language. And other peoples are going to move east in search of new farmlands and new supplies of water. And they will keep moving east until they get to the banks of the Nile River. And that, as you know, is one of the most ancient civilizations on the planet, with a written language, an established administration, a system of government. I mean, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but Egypt, the very word, which means the gift of the Nile was really twofold. It overflowed regularly each year, and the phonolic sort of decomposing elements, the silt in the river, created a natural fertilization of the plains around the Nile. Everyone knows that. More interestingly, what happens is the flow of the river Nile goes from south to north, but the prevailing winds go from north to south. So it is not only a geography that will sustain agriculture and human settlement, but it will also encourage trade because of the ability of, putting your ship laden with goods on the Nile, letting the currents carry you northwards, trade along the way, and the prevailing winds will bring you back home. And that is really the origins of the more ancient Egyptian civilization. But I want to bring us up to the more modern era. And I'm going to just arbitrarily say that the modern era for Egypt begins with the construction of the Suez Canal in 1869. And the reason why I use that as a point of reference, of course, is because that canal, dug by the French in a straight line across the desert, connecting the Arabian Sea with the Mediterranean, is, of course, particularly important for England as it links England with the crown jewel of its empire, India. But more generally, it facilitates the European trade with Asia in a way that doesn't require ships to circumnavigate Africa. So suddenly, with the Suez Canal, this desert real estate of Egypt becomes quite valuable. And that's where the British interest in that real estate really becomes ignited. Now, the British are interested in the Suez Canal, but it's a kind of a tricky relationship because the Ottoman Empire, which has ruled that area for centuries, has to be negotiated with. And what happens is, in round numbers, in 1882, the British government is going to exploit a particular period of sort of corruption and neglect in the Ottoman Empire and simply proclaim that Egypt is now within the, quote, sphere of British influence.